How good is Evasion in Fire Emblem 8? Which character is the best at dodging? The answer might surprise you. When my friend and I started crunching the numbers, my first guess wasn't even in the top 3, and the maximum possible evasion score belongs to a character that wasn't even on my radar. But before that, if you want to talk about evasion in Fire Emblem, there are 2 things you need to understand. First of all, evasion is an inherently unreliable strategy. The best tactics usually involve taking a series of actions where the results are 100% guaranteed, or as close to that as possible. This way, you can control and predict everything that will happen, and plan out a perfect clear. The Fire Emblem community, from my observations, has a pretty low opinion of evasion and other tools that require you to rely on luck in order to succeed, while on the other hand, strategies with perfect consistency are seen with a much higher value. The second thing to understand is that when you have a character pull off a clutch dodge, whether that's in the context of an Iron Man run, or you've just been playing a map casually for 20, 30, or 40 minutes, and you really don't want to have to start over. If you get into that situation where the character needs to dodge, let's say 2 attacks from the incoming enemies, and they actually pull it off, the feeling that you get, it's awesome. It's hard to beat that level of hype. So basically, just throw away everything that I said about the first point, because dodging is fun, and it's awesome, and it's cool. Now let's talk about the best dodge tanks in Fire Emblem 8. Characters in Fire Emblem 8 have stat caps based solely on their classes. Unlike many of the newer titles, the character maximum stats don't really vary based on any internal factor. They don't have any personal stat caps. All sword masters have the same speed. For this reason, we need to consider all of the classes with the maximum 30 speed, because this is the highest value, and then look at all of the characters who can access those classes, and compare them based on a variety of other factors. It's also important to have an idea of which characters are likely to reach these caps, and remember that luck plays a lesser but still important role in evasion. It is fun to see the most insane theoretical dodge tank that you can build with the maximum investment, but I think it's also practical to remember what the stats of these characters will actually look like during normal gameplay. First up, we need to talk about Joshua. For a lot of people, he might be the first character who comes to mind, especially because he joins early and probably leaves a strong impression on you. He's a swordmaster with high speed. He must be good at dodging, right? Well, yes, he is good, but in reality, he's not even in the top tier. You see, you can get up to 25 points of evasion from your support bonuses, but only if you have the right support affinity. There are 2 affinities which don't give a boost to evasion. Characters with light and wind affinity, they can never get this plus 25 bonus. The best they can get is an extra 12 points, and this is going to matter a lot later on. Characters like Erica, Joshua, and Matthew have access to classes with 30 speed, but their affinity holds them back. And to be honest, these characters are still very good at dodging attacks, but if we want to talk about the best dodge tanking possible, the best of the best, in theory, with the maximum investment, characters with light and wind affinity need to be discarded right away. The next thing we have to talk about is the terrain bonus to your evasion. In most maps and most situations, you will have access to some kind of terrain to help boost your evasion. Characters who can't take advantage of this bonus are at a great disadvantage. As it turns out, there's more than one reason why the speedy Pegasus Knights can actually be removed from the list. Funny enough, none of the flying classes actually even have the 30 speed cap, so they can't optimize evasion to begin with. This is weird to me because I thought the Pegasus classes would be faster, but the Falcon Knight caps at 28 speed. Anyway, the flying classes, they can't even gain the benefits of terrain, which means they can't get an evade bonus from forests, mountains, or forts. I really tend to think of Pegasus Knights as being frail but evasive characters, so this realization was quite shocking to me. Now, let's look at the remaining classes with 30 speed. We have Erica's Great Lord, the Dancer class, Swordmasters, Assassins, Rogues, and Rangers. We've already mentioned how Erica has the wrong affinity, so we can remove her unique class from the list. The available rogues are Colm and Renak. Colm has the wrong affinity, and Renak has his share of problems. He doesn't have very many levels to help him gain stats, and while he could cap speed with some lucky level ups and stat boosters, his luck is so far below the cap, it's unreasonable to consider him as a candidate. On top of that, to reach the maximum support evasion boost, he has to pair with exactly Dazla and Tethys specifically. He has no other options, so he's pretty restricted if you want to try maximizing him. And even if you want to just use him casually with the minimum investment, he's losing around 20 points of evade from his bad luck stat. You will feel this in the long run, that's 1 out of 5 attacks. I'm going to quickly explain the evasion formula. It's 2 times your speed and 1 times your luck. Then you add the other bonuses like supports, terrain, and the weapon triangle. Anyway, for these reasons, I'm just going to remove the rogue class from the list because neither of the candidates really fit. Tethys is our only dancer. She has respectable speed and luck growths, so it's reasonable to assume that she could cap both stats with a bit of luck and some stat boosters. Most importantly, this means that her evasion will keep up with enemies in the game as she levels naturally. For a normal playthrough, you're certainly not going to be using Tethys as a frontline fighter. She can't even attack, so I'd remove her from this list anyway, but it is useful to know that if she gets into a situation where she's in danger, she'll almost always at least have a chance to pull off that clutch dodge and save your run. Tethys' standout feature is actually the fact that the dancer caps at level 20 and never promotes. This means that if you just use her for dancing and gain experience from that, you can gain 20 levels and reach her full potential. You will quickly see her dodge tanking capabilities on display, while the other characters can require up to 40 levels of grinding to reach their peak. They'll break and replace a bunch of weapons, they have to engage in risky combat every time they want to level up, they gain experience more slowly after they promote, while Tethys can basically just dance over and over again and she will reach 20. The main problem with Tethys is actually her inability to access the weapon triangle. It's not just that she can't attack, but there are other important things to understand in this game. When you have weapon triangle advantage, you reduce the enemy hit rate by up to 15 points. This is a pretty significant bonus. It's about similar to what we see in those characters who are lacking the right support affinity, or the fact that Renak is missing his luck stat. Now, the weapon triangle can also be a curse, and we'll talk about that later. But I do want to say that Tethys' ability to dodge will always be consistent no matter what weapon the enemy is using, so you can look at the positive side of this. But you also have to acknowledge that she can't reach the same heights as the dodge tank who is benefiting from weapon triangle advantage. On that note, if you look at the female Great Knight, it has a speed cap of only 25. Now this is 10 points of evasion less than the 30 speed classes, but you have access to the full weapon triangle. She's always going to have a weapon triangle advantage, and in theory, this plus 15 evasion will actually put her 5 points ahead of the Swordmaster when she's facing lance and sword-wielding enemies. The problem with this theory is that she actually can't control the weapon triangle against bows or magic, and most importantly, in Fire Emblem 8, a lot of enemies are monsters who don't even fit into the weapon triangle, so while it's a fun idea, and I think it's worth noting that this niche does exist, I don't think it's as powerful as the Great Knights in Fire Emblem Awakening. I'm sorry, Amelia, but you're just not on the same level as Frederick when it comes to dodge tanking, or really anything else. So anyway, I got sidetracked, but let's remove the dancer from the list, and I'm not going to bother adding Amelia even though it's a little bit amusing, this whole Great Knight gambit. As for magic, things are a little less straightforward. In this game, most enemies use dark magic. Since Anima is weak against dark, and Light is strong against dark, you really want a class that can use light magic. Sages can do this, but they have a 26 speed cap, which is minus 8 evasion compared to the best dodging classes. A female bishop gets the same, but a male bishop actually has a lower speed cap, so only Natasha can really do this. Both Lute and Natasha are pretty close to reaching these caps on average, but the caps are low enough that it's not great. And while Iwan has access to the Super Pupil class, which has one higher speed cap, he doesn't have a good affinity for dodge tanking. This is also a good time to mention that attack speed determines your evasion, rather than your speed stat, and this gives an advantage to characters with higher constitution, because it allows them to use heavier weapons without getting weighed down. So while the male bishop has a lower speed cap, if you turn Molder into a sage, he has the ability to use Hellfire without getting weighed down, and this allows him to make the most out of his 26 speed cap. The mage classes are versatile, they don't get punished by enemy weapon choice very often, and they can counter at 1 range and 2 range. Any of the characters listed above should have a respectable performance if you get into a situation where they need to dodge attacks. But still, the lower speed caps are a problem if we're talking about the highest possible evasion. This isn't a video about the most adequate dodge tank. This is a video about characters who break the limit and go plus ultra. So then, with weapon triangle out of the way, we're left with swordmasters, assassins, and rangers. For most purposes, swordmaster and assassin are almost the exact same class. They're both frail, sword-locked classes who can hit the 30 speed cap. But the minor differences between them is also what sets them apart. Swordmaster has a bit more bulk, so it's more likely to survive in situations where you do get hit 2 or more times on enemy phase, although the difference is honestly pretty minor and they usually won't survive anyway. Additionally, it has objectively superior promotion gains, and this one does matter, especially if you're not grinding. It actually gets the same stat increases or higher in every single stat compared to the Assassin, which I thought was a little bit weird. Swordmaster also gives a boost to your sword rank when you promote, while Assassin doesn't give any weapon rank bonus. For these reasons, Swordmaster is the stronger choice if you want to get the most immediate benefit right away and have the highest bulk in the long term. So what does the Assassin have to offer if it's not good in the short term or the long term? The main thing that sets Assassin apart is their access to Silencer. This ability allows you to instantly kill any enemy, and it triggers half of the time when you roll a crit. Against bosses, this drops to 25%, and it doesn't work on the final boss of the game, but it can still be fun to watch it go off, I guess. I'm not going to talk too much about offensive skills, because this is a dodge-focused video, but if you're the kind of person who wants to roll the dice and rely on dodge tanking strategies, it might also be fun to rely on proc skills like Silencer. You might enjoy that kind of thing as well. That being said, when you land a critical hit, you normally kill the enemy anyway, and a Swordmaster has a 15% bonus to their crit rate, so it's no surprise that a lot of people consider the Swordmaster to be the superior option. Either choice is viable, but to keep this video simple, we can recognize that Marissa is the only person who fits this criteria, and she has access to both classes. We've already eliminated the characters who could go to Swordmaster or Assassin separately, so from now on I'm just going to say Swordmaster Marissa to keep things simple. Our options for Ranger are Nami and Garrick. Garrick is really loved by FE8 fans because of his high bases and his ability to promote into a hero right away to instantly become a viable combat unit. I will say that his strengths are better suited to the hero class, even if you aren't going to early promote him, but I won't dismiss him outright. Instead, let's look at the characters a bit more in depth and make our decision based on that. So both Garrick and Nami have a good affinity to maximize their dodging potential. They both have the same speed and luck caps. Based on everything I've said in the video so far and the concepts we've discussed, they seem to be roughly equal. In a situation like this, how would we distinguish them? Well, here's the thing. Nami is almost guaranteed to cap her speed, while Garrick is extremely unlikely to cap it without some serious speed wing assistance. Remembering that this video is solely about dodge tanking and not overall bulk, I'd give the edge to Nami for this reason alone. Additionally, she also has better luck, which makes her even more well-suited to this role. Another thing about Nami is that you get her early in the game. If you're making her into a project unit, you can start training her as soon as possible and start building up those supports to maximize her dodging capabilities. If all of that wasn't enough, let's also talk about opportunity cost. Nami only needs an Orion Bolt for her promotion item, and no one else in the entire game is competing for this. On the other hand, for Garrick, he needs a hero crest, even if you're going to make him into a ranger, and this item is going to be in contention with other characters. So, for example, for the purposes of this video, let's think about if you wanted to train Nami, Marissa, and Garrick. So Marissa and Garrick are fighting over the same hero crest, while Nami just gets to promote with her Orion Bolt that she keeps to herself. That is the most simple way to explain the concept of opportunity costs. Okay, so we've narrowed down our initial list pretty considerably, and it seems to be the case that Ranger Nami and Swordmaster Marissa are the best high-end options. They both have the same speed and luck caps. Out of the two, Marissa will have better luck, but the difference can be made up pretty easily with the use of goddess icons, and because Marissa herself is less likely to need those stat boosters, the two aren't actually competing over the goddess icons. Peak Nami and Peak Marissa, they can both exist in the same file with very little trouble. Nami's advantage of joining early on really shines here to me personally. This is because Marissa's biggest weakness is actually that she joins very late and at a low level. You can mitigate this by grinding, but it does come at the cost of spending time doing that grinding. And if you're grinding both units, Nami will still get there faster. If you've already been training Nami since the beginning, she's going to outshine Marissa immediately at the moment when Marissa joins, though in the end you can get them both to the same place. I think the biggest advantage that Nami has is actually her bow. Not only does it allow her to contribute on enemy phase against two range units with the right positioning, this is something that Marissa struggles with, but it actually has another hidden benefit. Do you remember our discussion about Tethys and how Weapon Triangle gives a 15-point bonus to Evasion? Well, the problem actually runs much deeper than that. When you have Weapon Triangle disadvantage, enemies actually gain 15 hit against you. This means that against lance-wielding enemies, Nami can switch to her bow and she'll be perfectly fine. while Marissa holding a sword is at a 30-point disadvantage when it comes to dodging the same enemy. The only way to avoid this penalty is by not matching Marissa up against lance-wielding enemies or to trade away her weapon, but constantly trading away your weapon is really clunky gameplay, and it means that she won't be contributing on that enemy phase. At least when Nami switches to her bow, she'll still be shooting back at 2-range enemies, while a swordmaster with no weapon is basically just a wall that you can move around on the battlefield. I think the best solution is actually just to fight the lance enemies head-on and eat the penalty. You can also rely on other units to fight those enemies, or, you could use a Lance Reaver. Problem solved. In theory, Nami probably takes the top spot over Marissa, but in practice, they're still functionally pretty much equal. However, there is one unit and one class, something that we have completely overlooked up to this point, a unit who doesn't struggle against lance-wielding enemies at all. Can you guess who it is? There is one character in the game who has the right affinity, he has access to a class that has a speed cap that is slightly lower than 30, but he has a unique way to make up the difference. You see, the Berserker class has only 28 max speed. With 4 less points of evasion, we kind of threw them out of the running early on for optimized theoretical dodge tanking. But 28 speed and 30 speed are pretty solid for dodging to begin with, and I was ignoring one important factor when I cut the Berserker class. The legendary axe, Garm, gives a +5 bonus to speed. This means that a maximum possible investment Berserker can actually reach 33 speed, and they end up 6 points ahead of Nami and Marissa for evasion, rather than being 4 points behind as their speed cap would suggest. Ross in particular has many of the same strengths as Nami. He joins early on, he has the right affinity, and he has a decent number of supports to choose from. Being a trainee, he has a lot of levels to gain stats and to work on his axe rank as early as possible. Coming back to our discussion on the magic using classes, it's worth noting that the Excalibur also gives +5 speed. This does allow Lute and Ewan to have 31 speed, and they'll have a decent matchup against many enemies in the game at 1-2 range. They don't have to worry about the axe, the lance, or the sword matchup. This gives them a lot of versatility, and while Excalibur does put them at a disadvantage against shadow magic users, you can just use the Sage's access to light magic, swap over to a light tome, and you'll have weapon triangle advantage against those shadow-wielding enemies. In a hilarious twist, Reeve is actually one of the few light magic enemies in the entire game, so an Excalibur Sage can actually run circles around one of the final bosses. Let's come back to Ross. Unfortunately for him, he has one big problem. His speed growth is nowhere near where it needs to be in order to hit this cap. He'll often need as many as 5 speed winks to make up the difference, and you only get 3 naturally in the game. Now, it is possible to get lucky, but in general, even if you train Ross for all 50 levels, he's not going to reach his theoretical maximum state. I wanted to double check the growths on Dazla to see if I was missing anything, but unfortunately he's even more sad. His speed and luck are both very low, and while Ross does struggle with speed, his luck is actually quite good. The extra 5 speed from Garm does help Ross close the gap with the other characters, and it even helps him exceed their peak dodging capabilities if you're willing to grind for stat boosting items. However, there is a problem with the Garm strategy. Being a legendary weapon, it has a limited number of uses. You could break it out when you want Ross to fight a really difficult enemy, but it's not something you're going to be using on enemy phase while dodge tanking a dozen attacks, or you would quickly break it. I will give Ross the number 1 spot as the maximum possible evasion stat in the game, in theory, because it's technically true, but I think in practical terms, Nami and Marissa are still fighting over the top 2 spots. Now, if I want to say one more nice thing about Ross, it's that the Berserker has a fantastic ability to move across many different kinds of terrain. This is going to allow him to get those terrain bonuses without very much hassle. Now, about the Sages and the Bishops, it is worth keeping in mind that they have reliable 1-2 range against almost every weapon matchup in the game, so even though their evade won't be quite as high as Nami and Marissa normally, for a practical choice, they're still really good options. In my opinion, I think dodging in Fire Emblem is a fairly underrated strategy. People get a little too fixated on optimized play at times and forget the value of stats, skills, and strategies that can be used by the other 90% of players who are just approaching the game casually. Mostly though, I think people look at the evasion stat in the wrong light sometimes. A fresh Marissa who has a good chance to dodge attacks but will quickly fall if she's hit twice or even sometimes can get one shot by the wrong enemy, yeah, that can feel pretty underwhelming. Why should I be using a character who has to dodge to survive when I can just use a character who I know is going to survive. The reality is that dodging is actually an extra layer of defense. It's not your primary layer of defense. If a character can only dodge, they're usually not a good tank outside of very specific situations that we will discuss in a few minutes. But when you're theorizing the highest possible evasion stat, that's all well and good, and it was a lot of fun to make this video, but I think the true value of dodge tanking is when it's used to synergize with traditional tanking methods, on top of everything else. The Great Knight Amelia, which we discussed earlier, she has total weapon triangle control and a respectably high evade stat to begin with, but most importantly, unlike Marissa, if she gets hit a few times, she's usually not going to die no matter what's attacking her. What this means is that Amelia can actually take on way more enemies because of her ability to dodge. Every attack that she dodges is one less attack that she needs to tank, but she doesn't need to dodge every single hit in order to survive. Let's look at it from a statistical perspective. If the enemies have less than 20% chance to hit you, and you only need to dodge one attack in order to survive, you could reasonably face a huge number of enemies, and you won't really have to worry. She's not a better dodge tank than Marissa or Nami, but she's usually going to be a better overall tank, because of course she's going to dodge at least one of those attacks. Dodging is just one small part of her kit that extends her survivability even further. Unless you're the kind of person who has a spreadsheet open while playing the game and you're planning out every single turn of combat with every single enemy action before the map even starts playing, this extra survivability does have value. It's going to save you in situations where you're not making the perfect play every time. Beyond that, there actually are situations where dodge tanking on its own can become a viable strategy. Fire Emblem 8 in particular has a surprisingly high number of enemies who have 100 hit, or sometimes even less. Even in the last few chapters, you likely are not going to have a perfect dodge chance against any of the last few bosses, but you'd be surprised at how many chants throughout the course of a full playthrough have a very low chance or even no chance to hit Ranger Nami or Swordmaster Marissa. Now let's look at the actual numbers. Marissa is usually going to have a base 86 evade at her peak, and Nami is only slightly behind this. Both of them can be pushed further with goddess icons, but I want to ignore that for the sake of this exercise. The right supports will give them an extra 25 points of evade. This means that even before you factor in terrain, weapon triangle, or stat boosters, these characters can reasonably have 111 evasion against enemies who have 100 or less hit. You can make it impossible for enemies to hit them in a lot of cases, all the way through to the end of the game. And when you scale these numbers down over the course of a playthrough, the matchups are still going to look pretty good. I'm not saying this is the new meta, and there are always going to be some enemies in pretty much every map that can hit you and will pose a threat. But it's definitely amusing to realize how effective evasion can become if you're willing to invest a little bit into it. Also, a lot of these late game maps do have defensive terrain that you can take advantage of, which makes these benchmarks even easier to hit. That's another 10 points of evasion, sometimes more. Darkling Woods, this is a map with heavy enemy reinforcement spamming, actually has a lot of beneficial terrain. So if you look at peak Berserker Ross and his ability to just run across rivers and mountains, you will really easily be able to adapt in that situation. So are you the kind of player who usually hesitates to rely on evasion, or you don't even really think that it's a valid strategy? Maybe in the next playthrough you could try something a little bit different. At the theoretical maximum, Ross can have an absurdly high evasion stat with Garm equipped, and that can lead to some hilarious situations, whether it's effective or not. Ranger Nami and Swordmaster Marissa can become nearly untouchable, and you just have to use them the way that they're intended to be used anyway. It doesn't require much extra effort aside from building those support ranks. And if you go with Assassin Marissa, you also get to see that cool special animation every time Silencer goes off. Most people already know that a bishop with Slayer can just rip apart most of Fire Emblem 8 with almost no trouble, so I'm not going to hammer that point too much. And while Amelia is never going to be the best unit in the game, and it will be a chore to train her without the Tower of Volney, even with the Tower of Volney, it's still going to be a chore, but she's really unique because she's likely to hit her speed and luck caps in Great Knight, and with that ability to dodge, it will extend her survivability and her tanking capability even further, and just like Ross, you could actually have her equip the Garm to break her normal speed cap. Would I recommend doing any of this? Well, maybe, if it sounds fun to you, but not really as like an optimal strategy. I mostly just think it's fun to talk about different aspects of the game that other people often overlook. I would like to do more videos like this in the future, but I need to know whether or not people are interested in this kind of content. Awakening, for example, is a game that I'd love to analyze, but it's so much more complicated. It would take a lot more time and effort to produce a video about the difference between Lon'qu and Frederick's evasion stats. If there are other games you'd like me to talk about, or different mechanics beside evasion that you'd like to hear me analyze, don't hesitate to leave a comment below. I read and respond to almost every comment on all of my videos. But for now, enjoy the rest of your day.